The Arizona sun beat down without mercy, bleaching the very color from the sky. In the dusty yard of the Hayes Ranch, a woman in a white lace dress, a dress meant for joy, stood trembling before a man whose world was as foreign to her as the dark side of the moon. Her tears traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, each one a testament to a future she never wanted. She was a sacrifice, a pawn in a desperate game of survival. Her hushed, broken sobs were the only answer she could give the preacher. And then a low voice, calm and steady beside her, cut through her despair. It was the Navajo warrior she was being forced to marry, and he whispered a promise that was both a comfort and a curse. "I'll make you smile someday." This is the story of that promise, a promise forged in tears, tested in blood, and fulfilled in the heart of the unforgiving West. The air in the Arizona Territory tasted of dust and despair. For Abigail Hayes, it was the taste of her own wedding day. She stood small and fragile in her mother's repurposed wedding gown, the fine Belgian lace a stark, mocking white against the ochre-red dirt of her father's failing ranch. The dress felt like a shroud. Her gaze was fixed on the gnarled hands of the traveling preacher, Reverend Michael Abernathy, his prayer book trembling slightly, either from the heat or from the palpable tension that suffocated the small gathering. Every face in the small crowd was a stone tablet of grim necessity. Her father, Silas Hayes, stood with his shoulders slumped, the weight of his decision carving new, deeper lines around his weary eyes. He wouldn't meet her gaze. To his right stood the reason for this entire charade of a ceremony, Bartholomew Thorne, a cattle baron with a smile as thin and cruel as a razor. Thorne watched with an air of proprietary amusement. He had wanted Abigail for himself, had wanted her father's land more, and when Silas had refused him, both Thorne had begun a slow, methodical campaign to ruin him. He'd damned tributaries, run off cattle, and bought up Silas's debt until the Hayes Ranch was a breath away from foreclosure. This wedding was Silas's last desperate gamble. A deal made not with the devil in a tailored suit, but with the people who had inhabited this land for centuries. An alliance, a marriage of his only daughter to a warrior of the neighboring Navajo tribe in exchange for peace protection and a united front against Thorne's insatiable greed. And so here stood the groom. His name was Ashki. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence a silent, powerful contrast to the nervous energy of the white men. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, his long dark hair held back by a leather band. His face was a mask of stoic impassivity, his dark eyes missing nothing. He hadn't spoken a word to her, not when her father introduced them with the clumsy finality of a business transaction, not when she'd flinched away from his proximity. "Do you, Abigail Rose Hayes?" Reverend Abernathy began his voice, cracking under the oppressive sun. "Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband." The question hung in the air, buzzing like the flies on the sweating horses tied to the fence. Lawfully. There was no law here but the law of survival. Wedded, she was being sold. Husband, he was a stranger, a man whose language she did not speak, whose world she could not comprehend. A sob caught in her throat, thick and painful. Tears, hot and furious, spilled over and traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. She looked past the preacher, past the stony face of the warrior beside her, to her father. She pleaded with her eyes a final silent appeal for him to stop this, to take it all back, to face ruin with her by his side, rather than cast her out into this unknown wilderness. Silas Hayes finally looked at her, and the raw agony in his expression was her answer. He couldn't. He was broken. Her gaze drifted to Thorn, who smirked, enjoying her misery. He lifted his glass of whiskey in a mock toast. He had lost the bid for her hand, but he was relishing her utter defeat. That single cruel gesture ignited a tiny, defiant ember in the ashes of her despair. She would not give him the satisfaction of a complete collapse. She drew a ragged breath, the dust filling her lungs. The tears kept coming, a silent, streaming protest, but she managed a small, jerky nod. I do. She whispered the words, tasting like poison on her tongue. The preacher, visibly relieved, turned to the groom. He stumbled over the unfamiliar name. "And do you, Ashki, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Navajo warrior did not look at the preacher. His dark eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond stoicism. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a deep, quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of her pain that was more unnerving than any overture of kindness would have been. He gave a single sharp nod. "Then by the power vested in me." Abernathy rushed through the final words, eager to be done. The pronouncement of man and wife was lost in a gust of wind that whipped Abigail's veil across her tear-streaked face. There was no kiss. There was no cheer. There was only a heavy, awkward silence. Silas stepped forward and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder, muttering, "You've done a good thing, Abby. You've saved us." It sounded like a lie even to his own ears. As the small, tense gathering began to disperse, Thorn sauntered over his boot heels, crunching in the dirt. He stopped before Abigail, his eyes roaming over her with an insulting familiarity. A pity he drawled his voice, a low sneer, meant only for her and her new husband. Such a delicate flower to be planted in the dirt. When you get tired of sleeping on animal hides and eating roots, you remember old Bart Thorn. "I'll still have a place for you." Before Abigail could even process the insult, Ashki moved. It was not a fast or aggressive motion, but it was absolute. He simply stepped between her and Thorn, his body a solid wall. He said nothing but his eyes now, as hard and cold as obsidian, locked onto Thorn's. The air crackled. Thorn, for all his bluster, was a man who understood violence. He recognized the lethal stillness in the warrior before him. After a long, tense moment, Thorn's sneer faltered. He gave a short, humorless laugh, took a step back, and tipped his hat. "Enjoy your wedding night." He walked away, leaving a trail of menace in his wake. Abigail was trembling, the encounter leaving her feeling even more exposed and vulnerable. She was now truly alone, her father's protection replaced by this silent, intimidating stranger. The tears she had been holding back began to flow freely again, silent and hopeless. This was her life now, a bargain, a piece of property traded for land and cattle. She felt a presence beside her and looked up. Ashki was watching her, his expression unreadable again. He had seen her fear, her despair, her utter brokenness. The last of the wedding guests were leaving their wagons, kicking up clouds of red dust that glowed like blood in the setting sun. She was his. As a fresh wave of grief washed over her, threatening to pull her under, he leaned in close. His voice was low, a rumbling whisper that was not harsh but impossibly calm. It cut through the sound of her own ragged breathing. "Do not cry, Abigail Hayes," he murmured, his English surprisingly clear, though accented. He paused, and she thought that was all he would say. But then he added the words that would echo in her mind for months to come. A strange and impossible promise, made in the crucible of her deepest sorrow. "I'll make you smile someday." The words didn't stop her tears, but they changed them. They were no longer just tears of grief, but of confusion, of a tiny, bewildering spark of something she couldn't yet name, lit in the suffocating darkness of her future. The journey from her father's ranch to Ashki's home was a silent one. He rode a sturdy paint pony with a quiet confidence that seemed an extension of his own being. Abigail was mounted on her own mare Buttercup, the last piece of her old life she had been allowed to bring with her. They travelled east away from the familiar flat scrubland and into a rugged country of rising mesas and deep-shadowed canyons. The landscape was beautiful, in a stark, intimidating way that mirrored the man leading her into it. She expected a village a bustling collection of teepees like she'd seen in illustrated books. The reality was quieter, more permanent. They arrived at a place of scattered dome-shaped structures made of earth and wood. Hogan's Ashki had called them the one time he had spoken during the ride. Smoke curled lazily from openings in the roofs, and the air smelled of cedar roasting mutton and a deep, earthy scent she couldn't identify. Dogs barked at their approach, and people emerged from the hogans to watch them pass. Their faces were curious but guarded. Women paused in their work of weaving or grinding corn, their dark eyes following her, the strange white woman in the ridiculous dirt-stained lace dress. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. Abigail felt like a creature in a travelling menagerie, a pale curiosity put on display. Her skin prickled with 1,000 unseen judgments. Ashki led her to a hogan that stood slightly apart from the others near a small, gurgling spring. It was larger than some sturdy and well-maintained. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and came to her side. For a moment she thought he might try to lift her down, and she stiffened, but he simply held the bridle of her horse, waiting. His patience was a constant, unnerving presence. She clumsily dismounted, her legs stiff and sore. The entrance to the hogan faced east, a simple blanket covering the opening. Ashki pulled it aside and gestured for her to enter. Swallowing her fear, Abigail stepped over the threshold and into the dim interior. The inside was a single circular room. The air was cool and smelled of smoke and dry herbs. Sunlight filtered down from the smoke hole in the center of the ceiling, illuminating a packed earth floor. Woven blankets of vibrant reds, blacks and whites were stacked against the curved walls. Clay pots, baskets, and tools were arranged with a neatness that surprised her. In the center was a shallow fire pit, its ashes cold. It was sparse, yet it felt lived in, complete. It felt like a home, just not hers. A young woman who looked to be Abigail's age was inside, tending to a loom. She had the same high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes as Ashki. She rose as they entered, her gaze sweeping over Abigail with an undisguised skepticism. "This is Yazi, my sister Ashki," said his voice, filling the quiet space. He then spoke to his sister in their native tongue, the words flowing like a river, rhythmic and complex. Yazi's expression remained guarded, but she gave Abigail a curt nod. Abigail clutched the small satchel she'd brought, a change of clothes, a hairbrush, and a small, worn Bible like a shield. "Hello." She managed her voice, a reedy whisper. Yazi said nothing, simply returning to her loom. The message was clear. Abigail was not a guest to be welcomed, but a burden to be endured. The isolation was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Ashki seemed to sense her discomfort. He placed a few pieces of wood in the fire pit. "You are tired." "Rest," he said. He pointed to a pile of thick sheepskins and woven blankets on one side of the hogan. "That is your place. Her place. Not their place." He was drawing a line, giving her space. The gesture was a small mercy, yet it also underscored their separateness. He was her husband, yet they were to be strangers sharing a roof. He then picked up a sleeping roll from the opposite side of the hogan, and without another word, turned and left, letting the blanket fall over the doorway behind him. Abigail stood frozen, listening to the sound of his footsteps receding. He was going to sleep outside. The realization brought a confusing mix of relief and shame. He would not force himself on her, but the entire community would know their marriage was a hollow sham. Yazi continued her weaving, the steady thump-thump of the baton, the only sound in the hogan. The silence stretched, becoming more unbearable than any argument could have been. Finally unable to stand it any longer, Abigail sank onto the pile of sheepskins, the soft wool, a small comfort. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and let the exhaustion and fear of the last 2 days wash over her. She didn't weep this time. The tears were all gone, leaving behind a dry, aching emptiness. Hours passed. The light from the smoke hole shifted, and the shadows in the hogan grew long. Yazi eventually rose and began to prepare food. She moved with an efficient grace, grinding corn on a stone metate, and placing a pot over a fire, she started with practiced ease. The aroma of corn stew began to fill the small space. Abigail watched, feeling useless and clumsy. At her father's ranch, she had managed the household, cooked and cleaned, but her kitchen was one of iron stoves and cast-iron pans. This was different, more elemental. When the stew was ready, Yazi poured some into 2 simple clay bowls. She handed one to Abigail without a word. Abigail took it, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she murmured. The stew was simple but nourishing, made with corn squash and small pieces of mutton. She ate slowly, forcing each spoonful down past the lump in her throat. They ate in silence, 2 women from different worlds, bound together by a man and a marriage neither of them seemed to want. As darkness fell completely, Ashki returned. He carried with him 2 buckets of fresh water from the spring. He set them down inside the doorway and looked from his sister to Abigail. He spoke to Yazi again in their language. Her response was short, her eyes flicking towards Abigail before she turned away. Ashki then looked at Abigail. "My sister says you have not spoken. She thinks you are a ghost woman, pale and silent." Abigail's face flushed with shame. I don't know what to say." "There is nothing you must say," he replied, his tone even. "But silence can be mistaken for pride or fear." "I am afraid," she admitted, the words barely audible. It was the truest thing she had said in days. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing right through to the frantic, fluttering heart in her chest. "The Dine, my people, we do not fear what we do not understand. We watch, we listen, we learn. Fear is a cloud. It will pass when you allow the sun to shine on what you do not know." He then took one of the blankets from his side of the hogan and once again departed, leaving her in the company of his silent sister. That night, Abigail lay awake on the sheepskins, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whisper of the wind against the hogan's earthen walls. She thought of her room at the ranch, with its patchwork quilt and window overlooking the familiar plains. It felt a world away, a life that belonged to someone else. She was a bride in a foreign land, married to a man who promised to make her smile while sleeping outside her door like a guard. She was an unwelcome presence in his sister's home. She was a stranger, an outcast, a ghost woman. Lying there in the dark, she felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, a sense that she had not just been married off but had ceased to exist entirely. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, painted in shades of dust and silence. Abigail developed a routine born of necessity and a desperate need to feel useful. She woke with the sun-fetched water from the spring and tried to help Yazi with her chores. Her efforts were mostly clumsy failures. Her attempts at grinding corn were slow and uneven, her weaving tangled and chaotic. Yazi would watch her with a mixture of impatience and pity, often taking the task from her and completing it with a flick of her expert wrists. Communication was a barrier of stones. Abigail learned a few words through observation, but these were just labels, not conversation. The deeper meanings, the stories, the lifeblood of the people remained locked away from her. The women of the community treated her with a polite distance, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She was Ashki's wife, a political reality, but she was not one of them. Ashki remained a constant, enigmatic presence. He continued to sleep outside, a silent guardian of the space he refused to share. He would leave early each morning with the other men to hunt or tend to the community's horses and sheep, returning only as dusk began to settle. He always brought something back, a rabbit for the pot, a handful of wild herbs, or a piece of interesting stone for his carving. He would place these items just inside the hogan without ceremony. They were offerings, provisions for the home they didn't share, and they only served to make Abigail feel more like a kept object. Their conversations were brief and practical. "The rains will come soon," he might say, looking at the clouds gathering over the distant mesas. Or, "The grey mare has a loose shoe." He never asked how she felt. He never mentioned the world she had left behind, and he never ever referred to his promise. The memory of his whispered words on their wedding day seemed like a dream, something her desperate mind had concocted. A smile felt like an impossible treasure buried on the far side of an ocean of sorrow. About 2 weeks after her arrival, the fragile monotony was shattered. A rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust, a rider from the west. It was her father. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. She ran from the hogan, ignoring the curious stares of the other women. Silas looked older, more weathered than he had just a fortnight ago. He slid from his horse, his face a mask of grim fury. "Abby," he breathed his relief at seeing her safe, warring with the anger that radiated from him. Ashki emerged from the pasture, where he'd been tending the horses, his movements calm and deliberate as he approached them. He greeted his father-in-law with a respectful nod. "Silas Hayes, your arrival is unexpected." Thorn Silas spat the name like a curse. "The low-down, cheating snake. He's diverted the Verde Creek. Just a trickle is making it to my land now. The herd is desperate for water, and he's got his men posted along the banks on my side. Says it's his water now." This was a death blow. The Verde Creek was the lifeblood of the Hayes Ranch. Without it, the cattle would die, the land would parch, and everything Silas had worked for would turn to dust. "He's trying to force me out. He knows I can't survive without that water." Silas continued, his voice cracking with desperation. "He thinks now that Abby's gone, that I have no fight left in me. He thinks your people will just sit back and watch." He looked at Ashki, his expression a desperate plea. This was the deal, Ashki. Protection. A united front. Ashki's face remained impassive, but a new hardness settled in his eyes. He listened intently, his gaze fixed on the western horizon, as if he could see Thorn's treachery from miles away. He asked Silas a few quiet, pointed questions. How many men? Where were they posted? What were their weapons? As her father and husband spoke, a cold dread washed over Abigail. This was why she was here. This was the purpose of her sacrifice. She was the glue meant to hold this fragile alliance together. And now it was being tested. The fight that had sent her here was now following her, its shadow stretching all the way to this quiet, peaceful camp. That evening a council was held. The elders, their faces like ancient maps of the land, gathered with Ashki and the other warriors in a larger ceremonial hogan. Abigail was not invited. She sat with Yazi outside their own home, watching the men come and go, their faces grim. The fate of her father's ranch, and by extension her own past, was being debated in a language she could not understand. Yazi for the first time spoke to her without being prompted. "The white man Thorn, he is a greedy man." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes," Abigail replied, her voice tight. "He wants everything." "He wants the water," Yazi corrected her gently. "Water is life. He does not want to share it. Our people know men like this. They come and take, and they do not understand that the land does not belong to them. They belong to the land." Her words held a simple, profound wisdom that made Abigail's own problems feel small and selfish. She had been so consumed by her own sorrow that she hadn't considered the larger threat Thorn posed, not just to her father, but to Ashki's people as well. The Verde Creek was a border, but water flows where it will. An act of aggression against Silas Hayes was an act of aggression against his allies. The council lasted for hours. When Ashki finally returned, his face was set like stone. He came into the hogan where Abigail was sitting by the low fire. Yazi had discreetly gone to visit a neighbor, leaving them alone for the first time in the dark. "My father," Abigail asked, her heart pounding. "The elders have agreed. An attack on our allies is an attack on the Dine," he stated. "Thorn has shown he will not respect boundaries. Today he takes your father's water. Tomorrow he may take ours. We will ride at dawn." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. "Thank you." He simply nodded, his gaze distant. He began to check his bow and prepare a quiver of arrows, his movements economical and precise. He was a warrior preparing for battle, and a chasm wider than any canyon opened between them. He was going to fight, perhaps to die for her father, for a deal that had cost her everything. "I didn't understand," she said softly, more to herself than to him. He paused, an arrow half-fletched in his hand. "Understand what? Why you agreed to this?" "To me," she clarified, gesturing vaguely at herself. "I thought it was just a trade. My life for your protection." He set the arrow down and finally looked at her. Truly, looked at her. The firelight cast dancing shadows across the sharp planes of his face. "When I was a boy, my grandfather took me to the top of Sebitai, the winged rock," he said, his voice low and resonant. "He told me to look at the land. He said, 'This is our home. It gives us everything, but its heart is delicate. When men with hungry spirits come, they do not see the beauty. They only see what they can devour. It is the duty of a warrior not just to fight, but to build fences of peace that are stronger than any war.' This marriage," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "is a fence. Your father is a man who was willing to build it with me. Thorn is a man who would burn it down. I fight for the fence." He was fighting for a principle, for a future, for a way of life. She was a part of that, a living symbol of that fence of peace. For the first time, she saw her situation not as a personal tragedy, but as a small piece of a much larger struggle. The realization did not lessen her sadness, but it gave it a new shape, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He picked up his sleeping roll. "You should not sleep outside tonight," she said suddenly, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. "You ride to fight for my family. You should sleep in your own home." He stopped at the doorway, his back to her. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then, without turning around, he gave a slight nod, unrolled his sheepskin on the far side of the fire pit, and lay down. He did not speak again. Lying in the dark, separated by the dying embers of the fire, Abigail listened to the sound of his steady breathing. It was the first time they had spent the night under the same roof, and as she prayed for his safety, for her father's survival, she realized that the whispers on the wind had brought not just a threat, but a fragile, terrifying change. Ashki and a dozen Navajo warriors rode out at dawn, their ponies vanishing into the amber hues of the sunrise. Her father went with them, his face a mixture of grim determination and gratitude. The camp felt quieter, emptier with the men gone. A palpable anxiety settled over the women as they went about their daily tasks, their eyes straying often to the western horizon. Abigail felt a new kind of fear now, one that was not for herself. She pictured the confrontation at Verde Creek, the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, the cruel set of Lyle Cobb's jaw, Thorne's brutish foreman, the possibility of a man like Ashki, who spoke of peace fences, being cut down by the blind greed of men like Thorne. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. Days passed with no word. The waiting was a slow poison. During this time, something shifted between Abigail and Yaji. Seeing Abigail's genuine distress for the fate of her husband and the other warriors seemed to soften the younger woman's guarded exterior. One afternoon, as Abigail sat listlessly outside, the hogan Yaji came and sat beside her, a bundle of herbs in her lap. "You worry for my brother," Yaji stated, her fingers deftly sorting the leaves. "He is fighting for my father," Abigail replied. "I owe him a debt." Yaji looked at her, her dark eyes searching. "It is more than debt. I see it in your eyes. When you first came, you looked like a trapped bird. Now, you look like a woman waiting for her husband to come home." The observation struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. Was it true her feelings were a tangled mess of gratitude, fear, and a burgeoning respect she was afraid to name? She had been forced into this life, but the man at its center was not the savage she had imagined. He was honorable, quiet, and possessed a strength that had nothing to do with cruelty. "He is a good man," Abigail admitted softly. Yaji nodded, a small, rare smile touching her lips. "He is. He has a quiet heart, but it is deep, like a well in the desert. You must be patient to draw water from it." This small exchange was a bridge. Yaji began to speak to her more, teaching her the Navajo names for the plants she gathered, showing her the proper way to knead dough for flatbread. She explained the patterns in her weaving, how each design told a story of their people, of the sacred mountains, and the holy sky. For the first time, Abigail began to see the world around her, not as a foreign wilderness, but as a home rich with meaning and history. One afternoon, while tending the small flock of sheep that belonged to Ashki's family, Abigail noticed one of the newborn lambs was struggling. It was bleating weakly, its coat matted with sweat, and it refused to nurse from its mother. The other women clucked their tongues and said it was a bad omen that the lamb was fated to die. But Abigail, who had helped her father tend to sick calves her whole life, saw the telltale signs of a fever and a blocked airway. She refused to let it die. Gently, she picked up the tiny trembling creature and carried it back to the hogan. Yaji watched, surprised, as Abigail carefully cradled the lamb, clearing its nostrils with a soft piece of cloth and dribbling small amounts of water into its mouth with her fingertips. She sat with the lamb all through the day and into the night, murmuring to it in soft, comforting tones. She brewed a weak tea from a willow bark, a trick her mother had taught her for fevers, and coaxed the lamb to drink. It was a piece of her old life, a skill she thought she'd left behind, and applying it here in this new world felt like anchoring a part of herself that she had thought was lost forever. Yazi watched her, saying nothing, but she kept the fire lit and brought Abigail a bowl of stew. There was a new look in her eyes, respect. By morning, the lamb's fever had broken. It stood on wobbly legs and gave a surprisingly strong bleat. A few hours later, it was eagerly nursing from its mother. When Ashki and the others returned late that afternoon, they were weary and dust-covered, but they were victorious. They had not shed blood. Their sheer numbers and unwavering resolve combined with Silas's legal claim had been enough. They had flanked Thorn's men, appearing on the ridges above the creek like spirits of the land. Thorn's hired guns, faced with a force that knew the terrain and was prepared to fight for it, had backed down. The dam was dismantled, and the water of the Verde Creek flowed freely once more. Abigail's father was safe. Her home was safe. As Ashki dismounted, his eyes scanned the camp and found her. He walked towards the hogan, his stride long and tired. Yazi met him, speaking in rapid Navajo, her hands gesturing towards Abigail, and then to the flock where the small lamb was now prancing beside its mother. Ashki stopped before Abigail. He looked from her to the lamb and back again. "My sister tells me you saved," he said, using the Navajo word for the small lamb. "It had a fever." "It's a simple remedy," she said, suddenly feeling shy under his intense gaze. "Nothing that gives life is simple," he corrected her gently. He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not the crying, terrified girl from the wedding, but a capable, compassionate woman. He saw the grime on her hands, from tending the animal, the weariness in her eyes, from her night-long vigil. A long silence fell between them, but this time it was not awkward or heavy. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. He had fought for her world, and she had nurtured a life in his. They were no longer just two ends of a bargain. He reached out, and with a startling gentleness, his thumb brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His touch was warm and brief, yet it sent a jolt through her that was as powerful as a lightning strike. "Yazi also tells me you have been learning the language," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He looked towards the setting sun, which was painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. He pointed. "Sun," he said. Then he pointed to the ground beneath their feet. Earth. He looked back at her, and his eyes were full of a warmth that melted the last of the icy fear around her heart. He touched his own chest. "Ashki." Then his finger pointed gently at her. "Abigail." She understood. He was starting over. Not as a warrior and his captive bride, but as a man and a woman. He was giving her the language of his world, not as a lesson, but as a gift. A small, tremulous feeling fluttered in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a feeling of hope. And though she did not smile, not a full, genuine smile, the corners of her mouth trembled with the effort. It was the promise of a smile, the barest hint of a sunrise after a long, dark night. And when Ashki saw it, his own stoic expression softened, and he knew that someday his promise would be kept. With the water restored to the Hayes Ranch, a fragile peace settled over the land. Silas visited a week later, bringing a wagon loaded with sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and bolts of cloth as a gift to the community, a tangible sign of his gratitude and the cementing of their alliance. His reunion with Abigail was emotional. He saw a daughter who was no longer drowning in despair, but treading water, her eyes clearer and her shoulders less slumped. "He's a good man," Abby Silas said, watching as Ashki demonstrated to a group of boys how to properly string a bow. "Honorable. More than I can say for most men I know." "Yes, Papa. He is," she replied, and the simple affirmation held a world of meaning. As the weeks turned into a month, Abigail's life found a rhythm. Her knowledge of the Navajo language grew from single words to short, halting phrases. She learned to cook bread over the open fire, to identify the edible roots and berries that grew in the canyons, and to find a quiet contentment in the steady, cyclical nature of life in the camp. She and Ashki still maintained a respectful distance, sleeping on opposite sides of the hogan, but their shared space was no longer a cold void. It was filled with quiet conversations, shared meals, and a growing, unspoken fondness. The need for a real town, however, was unavoidable. The community's supply of salt was low, and a potent sickness was sweeping through some of the children, requiring medicine that only the white man's world could provide. A trip to Redemption Gulch was necessary, as Ashki was a renowned hunter, and his English was the most fluent. The elders tasked him with the trading mission. "I will go with you," Abigail stated, when he told her. It wasn't a request. He looked at her, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "It is not a welcoming place for our people, and Thorn will be there." "I am no longer afraid of Bartholomew Thorn," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "And Dr. Peterson knows me. He will give me the quinine for the children without argument. It will be faster if I am there." He saw the resolve in her jaw and did not argue. The next morning, they set out on horseback with 2 pack mules, trailing behind them, carrying pelts and finely woven blankets for trade. Redemption Gulch was just as she remembered it, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a den of sin and commerce carved out of the wilderness. But seeing it now after weeks in the quiet dignity of Ashki's camp, it looked garish and loud. The stares they received were immediate and hostile. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass their eyes, lingering on Abigail with a mixture of pity and contempt, and on Ashki with pure, unadulterated hatred. Whispers followed them like blowflies. "That's the Hayes girl, the one who married an Injun. Look at her dressed in buckskin. Gone native, she has." Abigail kept her chin high, focusing on the solid presence of her husband riding beside her. Ashki's face was a mask of indifference, but she could see the tension in his shoulders the way his hand rested near the knife on his belt. Their first stop was the general store. The proprietor, a balding man named Chester Morris, served them grudgingly, his lips pursed in disapproval. As Abigail was gathering the salt, sugar, and other supplies, the batwing doors of the saloon across the street swung open, and Bartholomew Thorn stepped out, followed by his foreman, Lyle Cobb. Thorn saw them instantly. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. He crossed the street with a predatory swagger, his spurs jingling a menacing rhythm in the dust. "Well, well," Thorn boomed, stopping directly in their path as they exited the store. "Look what the wind blew in. I was wondering when you'd tire of your little adventure, Abigail. Come back to civilization, have you? We are here for supplies." "Mr. Thorn," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Now, if you'll excuse us." She tried to step around him, but he shifted, blocking her way. Lyle Cobb, a mountain of a man with a perpetually sneering face, moved to block Ashki. "Not so fast," Thorn said, his eyes raking over her simple buckskin dress. "A fine rancher's daughter like you, dressed in savage rags. It's a disgrace. Your father must be turning in his grave." "My father is alive and well, thanks in no part to you," she retorted, her anger overriding her fear. Thorn chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "For now, but this land has a way of swallowing up old men. As for you, that offer still stands. You leave this buck right here, and I'll set you up in a real house with real dresses. A white woman belongs with a white man." He reached out his hand, intending to grab her arm. In a blur of motion, Ashki moved. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't raise his voice. He simply repositioned himself between Abigail and Thorn, again his body a shield. His hand shot out and clamped around Thorn's wrist, stopping it mid-air. Ashki's grip was like iron. "You will not touch my wife," he said. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried a deadly weight that silenced the entire street. Onlookers froze, sensing the imminent explosion of violence. Thorn's face turned purple with rage and pain. "Get your filthy hand off me, you savage Lyle!" Cobb reached for the pistol on his hip, but a sharp voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Lyle." Sheriff Brody, an aging lawman with a drooping mustache and tired eyes, had stepped out of his office. He held a Winchester rifle, and it was pointed squarely at Cobb's chest. "Thorn," the sheriff said with a weary sigh, "you've been a boil on the backside of this county since you arrived. This man and his wife are conducting their business peacefully. You and your lapdog will let them be on their way." For a tense moment, no one moved. Thorn's hatred for Ashki was a palpable force, but he was also a pragmatist. A gunfight in the middle of town with the sheriff was bad for business. With a furious wrench, he pulled his wrist free from Ashki's grasp. He glared at Abigail, his eyes full of poison. "You've made your choice. You've chosen the dirt over a palace. Don't come crying to me when you're living in it." He turned and stormed back into the saloon, Cobb trailing behind him like a thundercloud. Sheriff Brody watched them go, before nodding to Ashki and Abigail. "Best you finish your business and head back. Trouble follows that man like a shadow. Our thanks, Sheriff Ashki," said his voice, returning to its normal calm. They went to Dr. Peterson's office and got the quinine and other medicines without incident. But the confrontation had left its mark. The ride back to the camp was quiet, but the air between them had changed. In that dusty street in front of the whole town, he had not called her a name in a contract or a piece of an alliance. He had called her "my wife," and she in turn had stood by his side, defending their union against Thorn's venom. That evening, as they sat by the fire in the hogan, the silence was comfortable, companionable. Abigail was cleaning the herbs she had purchased, her hands moving with a newfound confidence. "You were not afraid today," Ashki observed, his voice soft. She looked up, meeting his gaze across the flames. "I was. But my anger was greater than my fear. What he said, what he represents, it's wrong. He sees the world in only one color," Ashki said. "White. He cannot understand that a flower can be beautiful, whether it is red, blue, or yellow. He would plow them all under to plant only what he knows." She knew he wasn't just talking about flowers. He was talking about people. He was talking about her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite define, "for what you did, for how you stood for me." He simply nodded, accepting her thanks as his due. He picked up a piece of cottonwood and his carving knife and began to work the blade, moving with hypnotic grace. She watched him, the way the firelight played on the strong lines of his face, the concentration in his eyes, the gentle strength in his hands. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt a sense of peace. She was no longer Abigail Hayes, the sacrificed daughter. She was Abigail, wife of Ashki, a woman who had a place, a purpose. She had faced the serpent in Redemption Gulch and had not flinched. She had seen the ugliness of her old world and the quiet dignity of her new one, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was finally home. Vengeance came swiftly. A terrified ranch hand arrived with dire news. Bartholomew Thorn had returned to Verda Creek with 30 men. He wasn't just diverting the water. He was building a stockade, felling timber, and brazenly stealing the land itself. For the Navajo Council, this was a declaration of war. The decision was immediate and unanimous. Thorn had to be driven out, As the warriors prepared, Abigail insisted on going with them. "My father will be there," she argued, clutching a satchel of medical supplies. "Your fight is my fight. I can tend to the wounded." Seeing the iron resolve that had replaced her fear, Ashki gave a single, sharp nod. They found Thorn's camp a scar of raw timber and arrogant fires protected by a crude but strong stockade. A frontal assault would be suicide. As the leaders planned, Abigail had an idea. "The wood they've cut is green," she realized. "It will make a thick, choking smoke." The plan was set. At nightfall, a diversion drew the guards' attention. Then from the darkness, flaming arrows rained down, not on the men, but on the massive piles of green cottonwood. The wood didn't burn. It belched out enormous clouds of acrid smoke that poured directly into the stockade. Chaos erupted. Thorn's men were blinded and choking, stumbling in confusion. Under the cover of the smoke, Ashki's warriors swarmed the horse line, cutting the ropes and driving the animals into the wilderness. Silas and his men fired from the ridge, their bullets adding to the panic. The fortified camp had become a death trap. In the swirling chaos, Ashki confronted Thorn. With a roar, Thorn fired his pistol, but the warrior was like a ghost in the smoke, easily sidestepping the shots. The fight was brutally short. Ashki subdued the cattle baron without killing him, leaving him helpless and defeated. By sunrise, Thorn's force was shattered, and he was a bound captive. "You cannot own the water or the land," Ashki told the broken man, his voice calm. "You can only be a guest here, and you have been a very poor guest." The battle was over, the victory absolute. The reckoning at Verde Creek broke Bartholomew Thorn's power for good. He and his men were handed over to Sheriff Brody, and a quiet, solemn peace returned. During the victory feast, Abigail tended to the wounded, alongside the Navajo, her place among them finally sealed by shared struggle. Her father Silas watched her with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong, Abby," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was sending you away to save the ranch. I see now I was sending you home." His words healed the last of her old wounds. Later, in the warm glow of their hogan, the air between Abigail and Ashki was filled with a new, comfortable intimacy. He had been working on a small piece of wood for weeks, and now he was finished. He pressed it into her hand. It was a perfect miniature carving of her horse, Buttercup, detailed down to the unique swirl of hair on her forehead. It was a breathtaking testament to the fact that he had been watching her, seeing what she cherished, and honoring it. She looked from the carving to his face, her eyes shining. These were not the tears of sorrow from her wedding day, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. This quiet man had shown her more care in this single gesture than she had ever known. The promise he had whispered in her darkest moment echoed in her mind. And then it happened. A tremor at the corners of her lips blossomed into a full, radiant, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. It was the sun breaking through the clouds. Ashki watched her, his own expression softening with deep satisfaction. He had kept his promise. He reached out and gently cupped her hand that held the carving, his warmth, sealing their new beginning. A soft, happy laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure joy that filled the hogan and chased the last of the shadows away forever. From the bitter tears of a forced marriage to a smile that promised a new future, Abigail and Ashki's journey reminds us that love doesn't always arrive in the package we expect. In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Old West, they discovered that true strength isn't about conquest, but about building bridges. They found a shared language, not of words, but of honor, respect, and quiet acts of courage. Theirs is a story of how two people from different worlds, bound by a contract, came to forge a bond of love, powerful enough to face down greed and hatred, proving that even in the dustiest of settings, the most beautiful things can grow. If this story of resilience, unexpected love, and the untamed heart of the American West moved you, please let us know. Hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of survival, courage, and the enduring human spirit. We have many more stories from the frontier to share with you. Thank you for listening.